Lumpkin felt that both the physical and cultural existence of groups had to be preserved, and so he submitted to the Madrid Conference a draft law banning two linked practices: barbarity and vandalism. Oh, you fell on me again. Oh, Lord. Okay. Barbarity he defined as the premeditated destruction of national, racial, and religious and social collectivities. Vandalism he classified as the destruction of works of art and culture, being the expression of particular genius of these collectives. Punishing these two practices, the destruction of groups and demolition of their cultural and intellectual life, would occupy him fully for the next 3 decades. Stop falling on me, man. I'm trying to read you stuff about genocide. Lemke met with two disappointments. First, the Polish foreign minister, Joseph Beck, who was attempting to endear himself to Hitler, refused to permit Lemkin to travel to Madrid to present his ideas in person. Lemkin's draft had to be read out loud in his absence. Second, Lemkin had found few allies for his proposal. In an interwar Europe composed of isolationist, nationalistic, economically alien nations, European jurists and litigators were unmoved by Lemkin's talk of crimes that would shock the conscience. League of Nations was too divided to make a joint law, never mind the joint law on behalf of imperial authorities. The delegates talked at length about collective security, but they did not mean for the phrase to include the security of collectives within states. Besides, in the words of one delegate, the crime of barbarity took place too seldom to legislate. Most of the lawyers representing 37 countries wondered how crimes committed a generation ago in the Ottoman Empire concerned lawyers on the civilized continent. Although the German delegation had just walked out of the League of Nations, there were thousands of Jewish families that had already begun fleeing Nazi Germany. They were also skeptical about apocalyptic references to Hitler. When Lemkin's plan was presented in the president of the Supreme Court of Germany and the president of Berlin University left the room in protest, as Lemkin put later in his charismatically stiff style, cold water was poured on me. Lemkin had issued a moral challenge, and the lawyers at the conference did not reject his proposal outright. They tabled it, Lemkin noted. They would not say yes, and they could not say no. They were not prepared to agree or to intervene, even diplomacy across borders, but neither were prepared to admit that they would stand by and allow innocent people to die. Back in Poland, Lemkin was accused of trying to advance the status of Jews with his proposal. Foreign Minister Beck slammed him for insulting our German friends. Soon after the conference, the anti-Semitic Warsaw government fired him as deputy public prosecutor for refusing to curb his criticisms of Hitler. Jobless and chastened uh, by the reception of his draft law, Lemkin still did not question the soundness of his strategy. History, he liked to say, was much wiser than lawyers and statesmen. The crime of barbarity repeated itself in near biological regularity, but Lemkin saw that people living in peacetime were clearly going to have difficulty hearing. Never mind heeding warning pleas for early action. The prospect of atrocity seemed too remote, the notion to plot to destroy collectives too inhumane, and and the fact of vulnerable groups too removed from the core interest of our outsiders. Yet, by the time crimes have been committed, uh, it, would be it would be too late for concerned states to deter them. States would forever be stuck dealing with the consequences of genocide, unable to see or unwilling to act ahead in time to prevent it. Lemkin did not give up. Over the few years at the law conferences of Budapest, Copenhagen, Paris, Amsterdam, and Cairo, Lemkin rose in his crisply pressed suit and spoke in commanding French about the urgency of the proposal. Lemkin was the only European who had learned from the past. So, too, had Hitler. 6 years after the Madrid Conference in August 1939, Hitler met with his military chiefs and delivered a notorious tutorial on the central lesson of the recent past. Victors write the history books, he declared. It was knowingly and light-hearted that Genghis Khan sent thousands of women and children to their deaths. History sees him only as the founder of the state. The aim of war is not to reach definite lines, but to annihilate the enemy physically. It is by this means that we shall obtain the vital living space that we need. Who today still speaks of the massacre of the Armenians? A week later, on September 1st, 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland. In 1942, Hitler restored Telet's ashes to Turkey, where the Turkish government enshrined the fallen heroes' remains in a mausoleum on the hill of the library in Istanbul. Flight. If Lemkin had been in the position to utter a public "I told you so" in September 1939, he would have done so. But, like all Jews scrambling to flee or fight, Lemkin only had survival on his mind. 6 days after the Wehrmacht's invasion of Poland, he heard a radio broadcasting instructing able-bodied men to leave the capital. Lemkin rushed to the train station carrying only a shaving kit and a summer coat. When the train was bombed and set aflame by German Luftwaffe, Lemkin hid and hiked for days in the woods nearby, joining what he called a community of nomads. He saw German bombers hit a car crammed with refugees, and then a group of children huddling by the tracks. 3 of his traveling companions were killed in an air raid. Hundreds of Poles marching with him collapsed of fatigue, starvation, and disease. Under the terms of the secret Soviet-German deal known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviets invaded Poland just after the Germans, and the country was divided into Soviet and a German zone. Lemkin kept on the move until November 1939, when he wound up in a small town of Poland, Soviet-occupied half, and persuaded a devout Jewish family to shelter him for a few days. There, despite the warmth and generosity of the hosts, Lemkin was frustrated by their passivity and wishful thinking in the face of Hitler's brutality. There was nothing new in the suffering of Jews, especially in the time of war. The man of the house, a baker, insisted, "The main thing for a Jew is to not get excited and to outlast his enemies. A Jew must wait and pray. The Almighty will help. He always helps." Lemkin asked the man if he had ever heard of Mein Kampf. The man said he had heard of it, but he did not believe Hitler would follow through on his threats. "How can Hitler destroy the Jews if he must trade with them?" the baker asked Lemkin. I grant you some Jews will suffer under Hitler, but this is a lot of Jews to suffer and to wait. Lemkin argued that this was not like other wars. The Germans were not interested in only grabbing territory. Hitler wanted to destroy the Jews completely. In the last war, 15 to 18, he lived 3 years under the Germans, and the baker said, "It was never good, but somehow we survived. I sold bread to the Germans. We baked for them their flour. When Jews are an eternal people, we cannot be destroyed. We can only suffer." This disbelief, this faith in reason, and human contact, and commerce convinced millions to remain in place and risk their fates. Only a small number of Jews had Lemkin's foresight. The vast majority expected persecution, and maybe even the occasional pogrom, but not extermination. Lemkin studied the man carefully and reflected. Many generations spoke of this man. He could not believe the reality of Hitler's intent, because it was so much against nature, against logic, against life itself, against the warm shell of bread in the house, against his poor and comfortable bed. There was not much sense in disturbing or confusing him with facts. We had already made up his mind. Lemkin took a train to eastern Poland, where his brother and parents lived. He begged them to join in the fight. "I have been living in retirement for more than 10 years because of my sickness," his father said. "I am not a capitalist. The Russians will not bother me," his brother chimed in. "I gave up my store and registered as an employee before it was taken over by the new government. They will not touch me either." Lemkin remembered. I read in the eyes all of them, one plea: "Do not talk of our leaving this warm home, our beds, our stores of food and security, of our customs. We will have to suffer, but we will survive somehow." He spent the next day feeling as he was living their funerals while they were still alive. "The best of me was dying with the full cruelty of the consciousness," he noted. Before Lemkin left the town, his mother lectured him on the important book a year was not important. She reminded him that his goal of writing a book a year was not as important as developing the life of the heart. Lemkin, who had not dated, joked that maybe he would have more luck in his new capacity as a nomad until he had a member of sedentary society. He told his parents that he planned to travel first to Sweden, and then he hoped to the United States because that's where the decisions were made. After waving goodbye to his parents with a determined casualness, Lemkin headed towards Vilnius, Lithuania, a town bustling with refugees. He spent what was left of his money on 2 telegrams. The first was uh, fastidious scholar sent to Paris to inquire whether his publisher had received a manuscript that he had mailed a week before the war's outbreak. The second, a plea for the refugee, a plea for refuge. He dispatched to a friend, the Minister of Justice in Sweden. As he awaited notification from the Swedish consulate, he visited with various Jew intellectuals around town. None planned to leave. The life of a vagrant was not worth. The life of a vagrant was not agreeing with Lemkin. Although his acquaintances were generous, he felt his personality disintegrate as apathy set in. There were 3 things I wanted to avoid in my life. To wear eyeglasses, to lose my hair, and to become a refugee, he wrote. Now all these 3 things have come to me in implacable succession. He busied himself by buying a dictionary and learning Lithuanian from the daily newspaper. But the only arrival of a package from his publisher in France cheered him up. The publisher enclosed galleys of the latest book of international finance regulations, as well as copies of Lemkin's 1933 draft law banning acts of barbarity and vandalism. In his newfound free time, the lawyer immediately set to improve them. Lemkin's request for refuge was granted, and he traveled to neutral Sweden by ship. In February 1940, he was able to lecture in Sweden after just 5 months, an achievement he credited with enabling him to rise spiritually from the refugee. Fall of Modern Man. While lecturing on international law in the University of Stockholm, he began assembling the legal decrees the Nazis had issued upon each of the countries they occupied. He relied upon the corporation whose legal affairs had once managed from Warsaw, as well as Swedish embassies around Europe, Red Cross delegations, and German occupation radio to gather official gazettes from many branches renamed open in the occupied countries. In compiling these laws, Lemkin hoped that he would be able to demonstrate the sinister ways which law could be used to propagate hate and incite murder. He also hoped decrees and ordinances, in the Nazis' own words, would serve as objective and irrefutable evidence for the legions of disbelievers in what he would call the blind world. Lemkin was desperate to leave the libraries of neutral Stockholm and get to the United States, which he had idolized. Thanks to the professor at Duke University, with whom he had once translated a Polish criminal code into English, Lemkin secured an appointment at the Duke facility to teach international law. He flew to Moscow and took Trans-Siberian Railroad to Vladivostok, and then picked up a small boat where he, the other refugees, called the Floating Coffin, to the Japanese port of Suruga. He then took a bigger boat from Yokohama, Vancouver, and on Seattle of the new U.S. port of entry, where he landed on April 18, 1941. New beginning on an old crusade. Lemkin traveled by train to North Carolina, marking the end of what had been a 14,000-mile journey. The evening he arrived, he was asked to deliver a speech at dinner at the university with the university president. Without preparation or a full command of English, Lemkin urged Americans to do as the ambassador Morgenthau had done for Armenians. If women, children, and old people would be murdered for 100 miles from here, Lemkin asked, why wouldn't you run to help? Then why do you stop this decision of your heart when the distance is 3,000 miles instead of 100? He bought himself a white suit, white shoes, white socks, and a dark silk tie for his appearance before chambers and commerce, women's groups, and colleges. Members of his audience approached Lemkin after his talks and apologized for Americans' reluctance to join in the fight against Hitler. While at Duke, Lemkin received letters from his parents on a scrap of paper, a quarter size of a regular sheet. We are well, the letter read. We hope you are happy. We are thinking of you. Several days later, on June 24th, 1941, he heard a radio broadcaster announce that the German army had declared war on the Soviet Union, abrogating the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact that had divided the country into a German and a Soviet zone. Hitler's forces were now storming eastern Poland. Colleagues on the campus asked, "Have you heard the news about the Nazis?" Lemkin, dazed and sullen, looked down. "Sorry," they said, pulling away. Although Lemkin was panicked about the fate of his missing family, he busied himself by proselytizing about Hitler's crimes. The prevailing wisdom of the United States is that it had been on Lithuania, and that the Nazis were waging war against Europe's armies. When Lemkin told the U.S. government officials that Germany was also wiping out the Jews, he was greeted either with indifference or incredulity. But Hitler's declaration of war against the United States, Lemkin, then fluent in 9 languages, thought he might acquire more cachet. In June 1942, the Board of Economic Warfare and Foreign Economic Administration in Washington, D.C. hired him as a chief consultant, and in 1944, the U.S. Department brought him on board as an international law expert, but his horror stories were not U.S. governmental concern. My companions were mildly and only politely interested, he remembered. Their attention was rather absorbed by their own assignments. They were masters in switching the discussion in the right place. Lemkin reached out to those on top. He met with Henry Wallace, Roosevelt's vice president, and attempted to personalize his message. Ahead of the meeting, he studied up on the Tennessee Valley Authority project on irrigation, which he knew would interest Wallace, but the vice president had been raised in the cornfields of Iowa. Lemkin also slipped in references to his farm upbringing. Lemkin met with Wallace on several occasions and introduced his proposals to ban the destruction of peoples. I looked hopefully for a reaction. Lemkin remembered. There was none. Lemkin next tried to approach President Roosevelt directly. An aide urged him to summarize his proposal in a 1-page memo. Lemkin was aghast that he had to compress the pain of millions, the fear of nations, the hopes of salvations from death in 1 page, but he managed, suggesting that the United States adopt a treaty banning barbarity and urging that the Allies declare that the protection of Europe's minorities in Central War aim. Several weeks later, the Courier replayed a message from the President Roosevelt that he recognized the danger of the groups and saw difficulties in adopting such a law at the present. He assured Lemkin that the United States would issue a warning to the Nazis and urged patience. Lemkin was livid. Patience is a good word to be used when one expects an appointment, a budgetary allocation, or a building, or on a road, he noted. But when the rope is already around the neck of the victim and strangulation is imminent, isn't the word patience an insult to reason and nature? He believed a double murder was being committed, one by the Nazis against the Jews, and the second by the Allies, who knew about Hitler's extermination campaign but refused to publicize or denounce it. After he received word of Roosevelt's brush-off, Lemkin left the department and walked slowly down the Constitution Avenue, trying not to think about what it meant for his parents. He was sure politicians would always put their own interests above the interests of others. To stand any chance of influencing U.S. policy, he would have to take the message to the general public, who in turn would pressure their leaders. I realized that I was following the wrong path. He later wrote, "Statesmen are messing up the world, and only when it seems to them that they are drowning in the mud of their own making do they rush to extricate themselves." Those Americans who had been so responsive to Lemkin were not making their voices heard, and most Americans were uninterested. Lemkin told himself, all over Europe, the Nazis were writing the book of death with the blood of my brethren. Let me now tell this story of the American people to the man in the street, in the church, in the porches of their houses, in their kitchens and drawing rooms. I was sure they would understand me. I will publish the decree spreading death over Europe. They will have no other choice but to believe. The recognition of truth will cease to be a personal favor to me, but a logical necessity. As he lobbied for action in Washington and around the country in 1942 and 1943, he flashed back to the speech delivered by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in August 1941. broadcast on the BBC, which had urged the Allies to resolve. The whole of Europe had been wrecked and trampled down the mechanical weapons and the barbaric fury of Nazis. As his armies advanced, the whole districts were exterminated. Churchill would wonder, we were in the presence of crime without a name. Suddenly, Lumpkin's crusade took on a specific objective, the search for a new world. He replayed in his mind from the Churchill speech in response to the lawyers in Madrid to his proposal. Perhaps he could not adequately distinguish the crime of which he was campaigning against from typical wartime violence. Maybe if he could capture the crime in the world that connotated something truly unique and evil, people and politicians alike might be more excited about stopping it. Lumpkin began to think about the ways this atrocity and long-standing interest in language. Convinced that there was only the packaging of the deal and moral cause that needed refining, he began to hunt for a term to consummate with the truth of the experience and the experience of millions. He would be the only one to give the ultimate crime a name. And you fell.